started for this afternoon session. I'm Jeffrey Schnapp, a faculty member in Romance Literatures, a medievalist by training, so I take notes very seriously. But also the faculty director of metaLAB at Harvard, and one of the faculty co-directors of the Berkman Center. I thought this morning's conversation was tremendously rich, and I had to go to a meeting in between, in the midst of the second session. So as a true contemporary multitasker, I followed the conversation on the Twitter stream and was thinking a little bit about a couple of themes that came up this morning that maybe this session, which is focused, as you see in the program, on digital annotation tools. In other words, in a series of design questions, if you like, or architectural questions regarding the nature of note-taking today and how that process of designing tools for the present and future of practices of notation are connected to ideas we have about the role of notes, but particularly the cognitive role. And I think there were a couple of interesting threads in the conversation this morning that maybe will recur in this phase of the day's activities that had specifically to do with the ways in which notes serve as forms of ingesting information and then processing it, in a sense, then communicating it. Issues that have to do with the boundary line between private forms of notation and forms of annotative writing that are for purposes of communication and display. Also issues of what I guess I would call navigation in the cognitive sense. We have a rich table served up for you here. We're going to depart a little bit from the order in the program. And we'll start with David Karger, who's professor of computer science at MIT. His presentation, which will be 15 minutes in length, will be followed by a presentation by Bob Stein, the founder and co-director of the Institute for the Future of the Book. And our cleanup speaker, a final speaker, will be David Levy from the Information School at the University of Washington, a figure who played a very important role at Xerox PARC. So I hand over the podium here to David Karger.
Hi there. So I'm David Karger. It's fun being back in this room. In the 4 years that I was in college here, this was the dance studio. It was the best dance studio I've ever danced in. And so it's kind of a shame that it's full of chairs now, but that's progress. So I'm going to be talking about a tool that we created and our experience evaluating it in the classroom. And hopefully by the end, you'll be all excited and you'll want to evaluate it in your classrooms as well. We actually didn't start from thinking about annotations, but we're instead thinking about discussion forums and the benefits they offer in the classroom. The great thing about a forum is that it is not sort of bandwidth limited by the faculty member, right? Students can ask questions whenever they have them, not just in class, and they can get answers from other students, and you can have this sort of whole dialogue going on that results in peer teaching and thus in peer learning. It also gives the teachers a way to see all of this dialogue and observe trouble spots, things that aren't understood, and produces this very interesting archival Q&A record as knowledge accumulates over time. Expanding a little more on this peer learning issue, Michelin Chi is a professor of education at Arizona and has done a lot of work looking at different modes of learning. And the mode that we're sort of most used to in the classroom, where we stand up there and pontificate and the students are listening, is actually at the bottom of this hierarchy that she assessed, what she called passive learning. If the students take notes, then at least it's active learning. But you really want to take them up to a higher level of constructive learning where they're asking questions and self-explaining, or at the very top of her hierarchy is this notion of interactive learning, where students are engaging with peers to explain things jointly to each other, to attack or to support claims, and to reciprocally teach. And she's done a lot of measurement that shows that these higher levels in the taxonomy produce better learning outcomes. So if we can create a forum where students are talking and explaining to each other, we're bringing them up that hierarchy and hopefully improving their learning. The problem with discussion forums is that they're out of context. When you want to use a discussion forum, you have to interrupt the reading or studying that you're doing and go somewhere else in order to use it. And of course, once you've left your work, maybe you'll check Facebook or, watch a few videos on YouTube. You lose focus. And that can be a real problem. The forum is also very disorganized. You'll hunt for the answer to your question, not even sure whether somebody has asked that question before, whether the answer might exist or not. If you decide you need to ask a question, you have to carefully describe the context. What were you reading and what was it about it that confused you? And the next person who sees your post has to actually look at your question, then go back to the reading and figure out what question you were asking. And so there's a real problem sort of connecting the asker to the answerer. And it's also hard because the forum is disorganized for somebody who knows stuff to find questions that they can answer. They have to invest a lot of effort and they're not really perceiving a benefit. And so, looking at this, we dragged some data from MIT about the usage of forums at MIT for classroom discussion, and we found that the 50 most active classes at MIT using using the MIT discussion forum made a total of about 3,000 posts, an average of 68 per class over an entire semester, just a few per student. Not very heavy usage. So the idea that we started from was that the course content, the text that you're reading for the course, provides a context. And we would like to keep that context during the discussion that goes on around that text. And we'll do that by placing the discussions that are happening in the margins of the course text. And so this is where we migrated to annotation as opposed to discussion forums. And so we created a tool called NB, which supports threaded discussions, just like a typical discussion forum, but it places them in the margins of the document being discussed next to the content that is being discussed. It's a standard website. Faculty member sets up a site for their class, signs up their students, invites them, uploads PDFs, and then the students go onto that site and do their highlight sections of the text, enter comments, and reply to existing comments, just like a discussion forum. Here's a picture of the tool. On the left-hand side, you've got a text about atomic sizes and substance densities. On the right-hand side, you've got the margin, where you've got a list of discussions that are given at the top of the margin, and one of those discussions has been selected, and the entire discussion thread is expanded in the bottom of the margin. And you can right away see this is not quite like a forum, because there's this question, how did we get 3 from 1? Would you ever see that question in a standard discussion forum? No, because it wouldn't make any sense. What's going on here is that this is situated on a piece of the text where there is a number 3, and so anybody who sees that question knows exactly what 3 is being asked about. When somebody sees that and wants to answer, they just click on the reply button that you can see in the middle of the bottom pane. And they get a little box at the bottom where they can type in a response, and that gets appended to the discussion. So the benefits of NB are that you can discuss as you're reading without exiting the main view of the course text, and you can thus stay in the flow. Conversely, as you're reading, you see the discussion of what you're reading right now. So answers that can help you will be brought forward, and questions that others want answered, you have exactly the context for answering those questions as you're reading that part of the text. You don't have to explain that context because it's given by the geography. From the faculty perspective, there's this benefit also that you can see where things got annotated and find out what it is that is bugging students about your text. This wasn't a new idea. Back in about 400 BC, people wrote this small document called the Mishnah, and about 0 BC, people started annotating it. And then in the Middle Ages, they decided to annotate the annotations, and in the Renaissance, they annotated the annotations on the annotations. And I had to suffer through years of studying this stuff, so it was in my mind. More recently, Don Knuth published a textbook a couple of decades ago called Concrete Mathematics. And before publishing it, he had handed out a draft to his students, and they marked up the margins with all sorts of comments. And he liked them so much that he actually curated all of their marked up comments, all of the commentary that they'd put in the draft, and he incorporated that into the published version of the textbook. So the margins are full of interesting side notes and observations and humor and helpful ideas from the students who first read the textbook. And they're of great value to somebody else studying from the text. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's happened since we built NB. It's been used in about 100 classes now in a variety of subjects: physics, math, government, philosophy, most recently English by Leah Price. And about 10 universities, including this one, mine, Rochester, Texas, Sweden, Korea. People who use it once frequently use it again. And here you have some statistics on kind of the number of comments that have been created in various classes, and also the number of comments per student. And you can see this is far better than, we have several courses that by themselves did more comments than the top 50 courses at MIT. I'm going to focus on the top performing course where we did an intensive study of the annotations that were made and the process that students went through in that course. This is a course by Sanjay Mahajan on the art of approximation that he taught a couple of years ago at MIT. And it was there was a good circumstance that he had actually, before the creation of NB, had his students do reading memos in his course. He handed out the course text and he told them, write things in the margins and hand them back to me and I'll look them over and that'll help me understand what you understand. But he had a lot of trouble dealing with all of that paper and actually getting information out of it. He required annotation in the course, and we found that this is necessary because students never do things that are good for them unless you make them. However, we also found that usage of the tool doubled on average over the course of the semester. So as students discovered the benefit, they adopted it voluntarily, or that's my inference. We found extensive in-depth discussions where over 3/4 of the questions that were asked by students were answered by other students in generally less than an hour. Here's a distribution of the sort of shape of the discussion threads. So there were 14,000 annotations done by the 91 students in the class, about 153 per student. 3/4 of them were in discussions and 1/4 were in sort of standalone marks. There were 14 discussions on every page of the notes, and about 3.5 posts per discussion. That graph over there shows the sort of distribution of lengths of different discussions. So there were numerous very long discussions appearing on every page. In terms of the type of content, about 1/4 of it was substantive commentary about the content. 1/3 was substantive questions. 2/3 of that about the concepts and 1/3 about the meaning of the text. Another 1/5 was substantive answers, the vast majority by the students. And then another 1/4 of sort of random kibitzing by the students about various fun things. In terms of the resolutions, 50% of them were by students in the discussion thread, but interestingly, about 12% of the questions were answered in a different discussion thread, and that really has no analog in a traditional discussion forum, right? The point was that you could have 2 threads near each other that would refer to each other because they were both on the same page. And then some others were answered by faculty. One of the fun things about having an online tool is that you can actually monitor the students' reading. And so here is a distribution of when students actually did their commenting. Can anybody guess why there's this huge spike right over there? Well, of course, that was the due date. But interestingly enough, there were sort of bumps of about 1/4 of the students doing their annotations in the 2 days prior to the deadline for the course. Here's another interesting participation fact, which I really was interested in, even though it's from a different class. My student actually went to the class and looked at who spoke in class, and also logged who was participating in the NB discussion. And so he plotted for each sort of region of that graph, he's sort of measuring how many students did this many comments in class and this many comments on the discussion forum. And so that big spike that you see in red, that's the dead weight of students who never said anything in class and never participated in the discussion forum. Over here, you see a group of students who talked a lot but never participated in the discussion forum. But very interestingly, there's this brown boxed region which consists of students who never spoke up in class but participated a lot on the discussion forum. And so that's really intriguing to me. It suggests that there's no correlation between in-class participation and participation in this online forum, so that NB can perhaps open a new channel for students who are shy about participating in class. We surveyed students, asked them, what was their impression of NB. We gave them sort of a basic rating of 1 to 5, and they were generally positively inclined about the use of the tool. We got feedback from them about the fact that this gave them the most substantive discussion that they had ever had of material in a class. They loved this sort of collective intelligence aspect, that they could share what they knew with other students in the class and benefit from what other students knew. Something that took us by surprise was that the students really liked having this kind of measuring stick, that by looking at what other students were saying, they could say, oh, I'm not as dumb as I think, because there are other students who are also confused. Now, these things are just things that could be true of any forum if you could convince students to use it. I think the context provides more benefit than a traditional forum. But are there ways in which this context can be seen to be providing that benefit? Well, there were these context-sensitive comments, the ones that don't make any sense in a standalone discussion forum. And the fact that it's easier to ask a question in this mode. There's the fact that responses were able to synthesize multiple geographically close threads, which again doesn't have an analog in a discussion forum. When you see two different discussions happening about the same stuff, you may want to reply to both of them. And you can do that by just referring to the thread on the left and the thread on the right. We also, through our logging, found that 3/4 of our students never actually printed the notes. And given how much nicer paper is than reading on a laptop, right? This stuff doesn't work on an iPad yet, right? So just reading on a laptop is a painful experience. So there must have been a reason that they were doing that instead of printing, and we believe that it was for the interactivity with the discussion forum. To support that, we logged when did people actually do their annotating. And so we sort of averaged out over the course of a reading session at which point in the reading session did the students make an annotation. And you can see that that distribution is basically flat, that all during the reading, the students were also annotating and answering questions. The reply graph is very similar to the initial comment graph. So they didn't read first and then go back and have discussions, but as they were reading, they would discuss. So in summary, NB is this tool that tries to ground discussions in the text, and in doing so provide a context for discussion, direct you to relevant discussion while you're reading, and hopefully stimulates more substantial participation than a traditional discussion forum. Our assessment supports this. It suggests that the students perceive the value of doing this after you force them to use it, and actually leverage this context in the discussions that they're having, and engage in substantial peer teaching, which again is sort of at the top of this learning hierarchy, what has been shown to be the best kind of educational model. And so it really kind of takes annotation, which historically has been this sort of personal or for posterity kind of thing, and turns it into a synchronous collaborative discussion. Looking ahead, we're thinking about annotating other media, sheet music or images, or in a few weeks we're open to release an annotator for video so that you can ask questions as you're watching a video and have those questions attached to that spot in the video. We're thinking about richer annotations. You know, right now you can only type, but you might want to be able to do hand annotations and sketches and diagrams. We want to make annotations that allow you to relate multiple portions of the text and say, you know, there's a thing over here that seems to contradict that thing over here, and provides a navigation trail as a result of that annotation. We're also looking for ways to represent more than just this is an annotation and say, well, this is an annotation that supports what's being said here, and this is an annotation that contradicts it, and this is an alternative explanation for what's going on here. And of course, we'd like to annotate the annotations. Final thing I'll mention is that obviously annotations are content, right? You get this huge, massive student-contributed material, so how should you use it? Should you preserve it like Don Knuth did for the benefit of future students, incorporating it into the text, curating it and keeping only the good stuff? Surely all this content can provide value for future students. Well, in contrast, every single professor who's used NB so far a second time has started with a blank slate. They've tossed all of the prior annotations that were made. And this may be very sensible, because going back to that learning hierarchy, it seems that the process of discussion is more valuable than the process of looking at what somebody else has already figured out. So by throwing things away, you force the next generation of students to engage in the same sort of dialogue that provides ideal learning. So what this suggests is that even if you could create the perfect textbook so that nobody had to ask any questions, it would be a bad idea to do so because it would turn them too passive. But there does seem to be an opportunity, for example, to figure out which annotation stimulated tremendous discussion among the students. Well, let's not keep the whole discussion thread, but just hang on to that seed and actually get more dialogue by virtue of the annotations that we preserve. We'd also like to move from just annotating the content to letting the students engage in editing the content. And this is not something you do if the content is Virginia Woolf, but if the content is a textbook, you can imagine the students actually enhancing that textbook in various ways. You know, the extreme being Wikipedia, where everybody is equal. Here, the faculty might want to have a little bit more control than that over what the students do to the course text. So to finish, I encourage you all to try it. we've had NB used in a lot of courses, but mostly science, and I'd encourage you to balance that out with some close reading humanities courses. Leah tried this a few weeks ago, and I think had a pretty good experience, so you can ask her about that. The website is right here at nb.mit.edu, and we're very happy to help anybody who wants to get a site set up for their class, especially if you will then allow us to experiment on your students as they're using the tool. And of course, faculty never actually do any work. This is all the work of my graduate student, Sasha Zaito, who implemented the system and continues to make sure that it stays up for everybody. Thank you.
It's one of those classic moments when you have to completely throw out everything you were going to say. Because what I really want to say is what he said. I've been working for the last several years on a system that looks magically like that one. So I think I'm actually, instead of showing it to you, just trust me. We're in the same space, and I think I'll talk about something slightly, a little bit richer. I've been sort of involved in electronic publishing for a very long time, and for the first 15 years was kind of thinking about expanding the notion of the page to include audio and video. And then for the last 10 years have been sort of experimenting with what happens when you put a text into a dynamic space like a browser. And what we discovered pretty simply was that a book becomes a place where people can congregate. And it turned out to be really successful, and we're building this thing called Social Book, and it allows people to gather in the margin. When people talk about social reading in the marketplace, they usually talk about me telling you what I'm reading and taking out a little snippet and then you going to Amazon and buying it. And let's just put that one over there. That is an aspect of social reading, but it's not very interesting. A couple of years ago, we developed a taxonomy of social reading and really have identified 4, I think actually 5 flavors. And I just want to talk about that because they all have to do with note-taking, as it were. The first is being able to read with a group of people you know, where there's a very, very high signal-to-noise ratio. Students in a class are a good example. A reading group is another example, where I really care what each of the people has to say. That's one flavor. And in our system, we've got that, but then you can flip a switch in effect and suddenly have a view of comments that everybody who's read this document has made. This gets back to what David was saying, the possibility of one year building on the next. And so there's sort of the wisdom of the crowd. And it's a little bit different because in the crowd, the quality of the commentary is of quite varied interest to you. So we've made it possible to both rate those and rank those and sort them. Theoretically, a class at Harvard could be linked to a class at MIT, either a present class or a class in the past. A third flavor would be the presence of an expert, somebody who actually knows something about this content. I was once showing this to somebody in the trade division of Macmillan, and she said, "You're nuts. People don't have enough time to read as it is. Why would you think we're going to read this carefully?" And I tried to explain that in fact, reading was on its way to bifurcating, that there were a small number of things that we were going to read very carefully and mark up, and there were a large number of things that, in fact, we were going to have to learn how to skim. And that skimming is something where we really could use some tools, and we realized one day that if Jeffrey were to mark up a book, perhaps his last book on electric, what's it called? Electric Information Age, then, and he underlines basically the 37 passages that he thinks are really important and annotates them, then instead of spending, an evening with that book, I can spend an hour with it and I can skim it with his intelligence. But the really neat thing is it's not a digest. I'm actually in the book. So if I come to a passage which is particularly important to me, I can keep going. I know this may be anathema to some of you who can't imagine not reading something in its entirety, but realistically, think forward, 20, 30 years from now, with all of analog culture behind us. The ability to scan things with intelligence is going to be quite useful. Fourth flavor would be the presence of the author in the text, whether it's live, the author is going to give a talk. I don't know if some of you are old enough to have remembered a little video that Apple made called the Knowledge Navigator, where one professor calls up another professor and asks if she could appear in his class, and in effect in her book, on the page of her book. So that's another idea of social reading. Another flavor is what I call longitudinal. I read the Hunger Games trilogy not that long ago. It was one of these things I'd never heard of until suddenly the movie came out, and I got fascinated by it. And I read it very consciously with my granddaughter in mind. I was reading it on my computer, and I marked it up extensively, a lot of notes. And with the idea that 10 years from now, Penelope is going to read the Hunger Games trilogy, and she'll have access to her grandfather's notes if she wants. The reality is that once you start to do this, once you start to read with the sense that other people are present, either immediately or asynchronously, contemporaneously, or a long time from now, it changes the way you read. I think the big aha moment for me was a couple of years ago. I was part of an experiment. When you read in a Kindle reader, Amazon very sweetly keeps all of your markup for you in a private page. Well, I gave permission to this experiment to take all of my markup and make it public. And one day I got an email note that a relatively famous researcher from Microsoft, famous in our little space here, named Dana Boyd, had copied a note that I had written in a book by Douglas Rushkoff into her copy of the book. Now, I happen to know Dana, but I went, wow. I had no idea she was reading that book. I had no idea she was following me. And from that moment, and this is quite true, I've been very conscious that when I read and I mark up a book, which I do a lot more now that I've got everything electronically, that I'm doing this in a public sense, that I am playing a role as a public intellectual, and it's completely changed the way that I read. I read way more carefully as a result, and I don't think that's a bad thing. It's not that I'm managing my persona, which of course I am, my public persona, but I'm also trying to do my bit. Some of you may know an internet or media theorist named Geert Lovink, and I'm really, one of the things I'm proudest of in my life is that Geert named a law after me. It's the Bob Stein law, the inverse proportion law of commenting on a website. That the more you want to see somebody's comment on that website, the less likely they are to have commented there. And there are a lot of reasons for this, and hopefully it will change over time. But I'll finish now, and hopefully if I have any leftover minutes, we can use them in questions. The idea that reading is something you do by yourself is very, very recent. A couple hundred years maybe. My sense is that what's happening inevitably and beautifully and wonderfully is that as we start to absorb texts online, we're going to have the advantage of each other's intelligence. There's a fantastic phrase by a computer scientist, Alan Kay, that point of view is worth 80 IQ points. And all Alan meant by that was that me by myself trying to understand something, I can get just so far. But if Jeffrey and I can read together, suddenly, I say something, he takes it off 30 degrees, and I go, wow. And then we go to an entirely new place. And the power of multiple points of view focused on a specific text, not about a text, but in a text, is incredibly exciting. And if you contact me, futureofthebook@gmail.com, I can let you into our system, which is it's probably a little bit more elegant graphically, but it's and similar power. One minor point of competition: we actually have video commenting working already. Anyway, thank you.
So hello, everyone. I'm David Levy. I think I'm on this panel because, like the others, in one sense or another, I'm a technologist. But actually, you're going to hear from me a kind of different perspective on what we've been talking about today than what I've heard so far, that I hope you will find expands the conversation and isn't a distraction. First, let me just say that I love the topic of note-taking. I mean, as an academic and as a lifelong learner, I've been taking notes all my life, and I've been self-conscious and reflective about it. I see how my note-taking practice continues to change as the technologies change, as my stage in life changes, and so on. And in another context, I would love to tell you about that and how wonderful, in a way, it is to have such a remarkable set of tools. I say I'm a technologist by training. I actually did my PhD in computer science at the same small institution in Palo Alto that the other David did. But I also have a degree in calligraphy and bookbinding. And there's a whole long story about how it is that I have, ever since graduate school, been trying to figure out how to hold, on the one hand, the side that is a technologist that first learned to program computers in New York City at Stuyvesant High School when I was 15, when it was almost impossible to get your hands on a computer. That part of me that loved all of that. And the other part of me that at some point started to realize that I needed more, that especially in graduate school and after, that I needed to get in touch with parts of myself beyond this part here, and began to get interested in craft work and the place of the body, and began to sort of look at the relationship between, if you like, the fast world, the fast digital world, and the slow world of craft and contemplation. So I'm going to be speaking out of the tension that I feel between those two sides, and in a sense representing some other perspectives than what you heard here. First of all, when I think about my own note-taking, I think about it less as an issue of memory and remembering, and more in some ways in respect to what I heard the two previous speakers, especially David Karger, talking about. For me, note-taking is a practice that helps me engage in the moment with whatever I'm studying. Whether it's a text, whether I'm listening, as some of you are listening to me now and taking notes. For me, at its best, it's a sharpening of my attentional abilities and my ability to establish a more intimate connection with what's actually happening in the moment. And in that sense, when I think about note-taking, I can't separate note-taking really, ultimately, from reading, from other forms of writing, and from thinking, from the active process of thinking about, mulling over, reflecting on what I'm reading. What I love most about learning and scholarship personally, and I'm sure there are many of you, and maybe all of you know this experience, the times when I am so completely connected to my subject matter that it is, well, there are no words for that. It's beautiful. There's a quality of love. I might even evoke, Martin Buber's notion of I, thou. And it seems to me that part of what it is to do scholarship, to do research, and to teach other people about this is to convey something about the experience of being engaged and deeply connected to one's subject matter. That is something that I think people don't talk about very much. I've gone around and talked to people at various times. I remember talking to a Leonardo scholar when I was at a conference in Amsterdam about his experience of working with some of Leonardo's notebooks. And what I was interested in was his experience. And he said some really exceptional things about what it felt like, right? The sense that he was making a kind of contact, and he didn't mean this in a woo-woo way necessarily, but in a sense with Leonardo's spirit and something much deeper. And I said, have you ever written about this? He said, oh, I could never write about this. And yet, to me, what I'm trying to suggest to you as a beginning is that this is, at least for me, and I think for many other people, this is what feeds us. It's not just the results. It's not just the product that we produce, the publication. It's actually how we are deeply engaged, and the word that I would use for that is contemplatively engaged. Contemplative can mean, if you look in the dictionary, it means essentially to think about or ponder. But I mean a form of contemplative engagement that is much deeper. And the concern that I have, again, sitting here between my technology and my craft contemplative side, is that there's some very powerful forces at work in our culture taking us away from that contemplative dimension. And I want to explain that, and I want to give you, with apologies to all the historians in the room, I want to give you a little bit of my attempt to understand the history of this challenge, and I look forward to being corrected. A lot of the work that I've been doing in recent years as a technologist is my concern for the quality of life. And if I say words like information overload, or distraction, or acceleration, or no time to think, I think you know what I mean, which is that there's a dimension of our culture that seems to mitigate against longer stretches and qualities, longer stretches of time and qualities of immersive attention. So this became really painfully important to me when I made the transition about 10 or 12 years ago from working in a think tank to becoming an academic. Because as I've said to many audiences over this time, I feel like I moved from a think tank to a no think tank. A place where so many demands and requirements that it's almost, and maybe it's only, state universities like the University of Washington, and maybe it's different at Harvard, and I'd love to hear that. But the feeling is that there is not much priority on deeper forms of reflection, and there is not much reward for doing it, as opposed to the reward for publication, which is I'm going to get to in a minute. But I formulated the following question about 7 or 8 years ago, which I then tried to answer. My question was, we now have the most remarkable tools for scholarship and learning the world has ever known. How is it that we have less time to think than ever before? Isn't there something, first of all, if that is true, it's an interesting seeming paradox. So let me tell you my answer to that. First of all, some of you will have read Vannevar Bush's famous 1945 article, As We May Think. Show of hands, not very many in this, some. It's in my field, it's one of the texts. It's the document in which the engineer, Vannevar Bush, suggested that there was a looming problem of information overload, although the phrase had not yet been coined in the culture. And he proposed an information device, which he called the Memex, that would allow people to link various pieces of information on microfilm. And so, of course, he is in some sense the grandfather of the web. What few people have commented on is that if you go back and actually read that article, I mean, really read it, that what Bush is worrying about is that we're going into a culture where there will be less and less time for what he calls, these are his words, mature and creative thinking. Yes, there will be plenty of time for more automatized and rational forms, but he thinks that if we could have a device that would automate the more routine aspects of thinking, then scholars and researchers would have more time to really enter into their subject matter in the ways that I'm talking about. Well, guess what? So far, at least, it hasn't happened, right? And my sense of why that is we have to look to the Industrial Revolution, the industrial era, and our more, faster, better attitude toward life, which is an entire culture primarily rewarding us for efficient production and consumption. Many people have said this before. I'm not the first. And my feeling is that while this needn't solely be true, and it certainly isn't true for my fellow panelists, that by and large, the money and the energy that has gone into the development of these remarkable information tools is to support our more, faster, better mode of life. The problem, or one of the problems, and I'm going to quote from a Norwegian anthropologist, Thomas Eriksson, who wrote a book called Tyranny of the Moment in 2001, the problem, he says, is a distinction between what he calls fast and slow time. And he says, when fast and slow time meet, fast time wins. That's why one never gets the important things done, because there's always something else one has to do first. Naturally, we will always tend to do the most urgent tasks first. We know this. In this way, the slow and long-term activities lose out. In an age when the distinctions between work and leisure are being erased, and efficiency seems to be the only value in economics, politics, and research, this is really bad news for things like thorough, far-sighted work, play, and long-term love relationships. It's also really bad news for thinking, because thinking is a slow-time activity that cannot be scheduled and requires, I believe, the expansion of oneself and the time to reflect and maybe even to do things that don't look like work at all, like take a walk or have interesting conversations with friends and so on. So this is my sense of the world that we've been living under, but what about universities? And am I right in thinking that universities are turning into no think tanks? I mean, when I first got to the University of Washington, I thought, oh no, I thought universities would be leading the culture, not following the larger corporate culture. But then, through a little bit more of my own historical research, what I discovered was that, in fact, that engineers and the engineering perspective that brought us more, faster, better, that the engineers had a very strong hand in the creation and structuring of the modern university. I knew before this, of course, that the engineers, built wonderful factory machines, helped design factory processes. Books like Joanne Yates' Control Through Communication talk about the ways in which the engineers actually had a very strong hand in the creation of the modern corporation. What I didn't realize was that what a strong hand they had in the debates about how the modern university would be created. And I want to introduce a book into evidence, which I carried all the way. Well, of course, I was on a plane, so I didn't have to carry it, but from the University of Washington Library, and I want to give you a couple of quotes from it. It's a wonderful report, 1910, called Academic and Industrial Efficiency. It's the 5th bulletin out of the newly formed Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Henry Pritchett, who had been the head of MIT, in 1906 becomes the head of this new Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And what the foundation starts to ask is, how can we make universities more like industry? Shouldn't we be doing that? Because, in fact, what's happening is industrialists are sitting on the boards of these newly reformed educational institutions, and they go to Taylor, the famous stopwatch guy, and say, we want somebody who would actually help us with this. And he says, I've got the man for you. His name is Morris Llewellyn Cook, mechanical engineer, member of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And this is a kind of smoking gun document that describes the beginning, 100 years ago, of the attempt to fashion the university as an engine of efficient production consumption. So, for example, Cook says the following in 1910. Until efficiency is used as the sole standard for the teaching profession, I'll say that again, until efficiency is used as the sole standard for the teaching profession, as it is coming to be used practically in all other walks of life, any goal satisfactory alike to the community and to the teacher will be difficult of attainment. I think that means satisfactory alike to the community means the business community, right? Or another quote. If the same standards of efficiency are to be applied to college teachers as are applied elsewhere, it will mean that when a man has ceased to be efficient, he must be retired as he would be in any other line of work, like on the assembly line, right? Or if he no longer performs a given function in an efficient manner, that he be relieved of this function. The next year, by the way, there's a very interesting article in the Atlantic Monthly by a man whose identity I have not determined, Henry Davis Bushnell, who says some of the things we're still trying to say in response. He says, so this is 1911, and he's responding to this report. He says, we will gladly see gardeners and janitors, bookkeepers and others who carry on the true business machinery of the university, caused to labor under conditions of the least waste and the greatest efficiency. But never with equanimity can we grant that there exists a parallel, an analogy between the processes of turning out steel rails and those of turning out men of the widely diversified capacities of our AB degree holders. There's a lot of language during this time about how universities are really kind of machines, just as factories and corporations are. Or listen to this, just one more quote from him. He says, "No right-thinking person should agree that every hour that he," and it's ambiguous whether he means the student or the professor, "that every hour that he occupies 2 square feet of lecture room space, he must be expected to produce so many dollars worth of lecture room professor-student hours," all hyphenated, "worth of education in money value. Produce," he thunders, "this is not what he is there for, and this is what makes the fallacy in the argument apparent. Industrial methods of efficiency look to the production of a commodity at the least expense for the greatest profit. All is subordinated to that theory." That's the beginning, and we've been living with what I would say is a vast intensification of that attitude toward education. Not only that, but it's being pushed earlier and earlier into the human learning cycle. So, for example, in the last 10 years, there's been a movement to eliminate recess from elementary schools. I don't know if you know about that. It's considered not productive time. Or even in kindergarten now, that free play is increasingly endangered because instead of preparation, to make room for preparation for standardized tests. So I see an attitude, a philosophy of life, globalizing and moving earlier and earlier. And all of this, to me, militates against the kinds of time to think, to reflect, to go deeply into and connect with our subject matter and with people that I think I'm not alone in feeling that we are actually experiencing. There's one other dimension that I want to mention, which I'd love to hear what my colleagues think about this, or any of you. I've been spending a lot of time over the last 5 years talking with undergraduates around the country about their relationship to the new technologies. And that's a whole other subject matter that I'm not going to go into. But one of the things that I have come to say in classrooms around the country is that I feel like students today are getting a double message. And it's because of the device, the wonderful, powerful, amazing device, which is the laptop. Because on the one hand, students are being told, study hard, you'll get a great job, you'll have a great life. But the very device that gives them all these remarkable opportunities is the very same device that is the ultimate consumerist device for music, for entertainment, for shopping, for pornography, you name it. I mean, in my day, maybe I had a TV in the same room, but I certainly didn't have it smushed up against my textbook. So that I feel that the learning environment that we've created, powerful and wonderful though it is, needs to be balanced by some of these understandings of the contemplative possibilities. And I believe we can do that. So I see I'm basically out of time. Really what I want to say to all of you is that I am actually optimistic. I mean, in the sense that all of us, I think, are holding a piece of the contemplative dimension. And it's not a matter of simply going along with more, faster, better attitudes, but really recognizing that universities and educations could be a place to cultivate this. If I could have the slide, this is the very last thing I want to show you. So look at this image, which I found in the New York Times Magazine about 7 or 8 years ago. What does it show? It shows a guy on a laptop, and where is he sitting? He's sitting in the stacks of the library. To me, this is, and the copy text says in deep halcyon repose, and it gives the dictionary definition of halcyon as peaceful. To me, this is actually, an advertising agency speaking to both sides of what it is that I think and hope and believe that we can integrate. Now, what's interesting about this ad is I used it in a talk at the information school days after I saw it, and one of the librarians, who's no longer at the University of Washington, sent me an email the next day, and she said, "David, I think that ad was shot at the University of Washington." And I thought, well, how could this be? I mean, it's a New York agency, maybe it's LA, how could it possibly be New York? And she said, well, they told me it's in the basement of the East Asia Library. So could I have the next slide? So in fact, we went to there. The chair was still in the same place. This is not a Photoshop job. This is me with a beard, not Photoshopped out, sitting in the very same place. And what it suggests to me, I'm not suggesting that the answer to contemplative balance is only library spaces and contemplative spaces. But it seems to me that the opportunity that I'm excited about and that we have is to figure out how these two dimensions, the power of these technologies to take notes, to think, to read deeply, to be connected with people, can be combined in a culture like ours that I think less and less is privileging that. And I hope that we will all be part of that in the future. Thank you.
There were a couple of themes that were both exposed in a significantly underscored, and others that were I think recurrent sub-threads that I thought were interesting. And one of them has to do with this issue that David Levy brought up, but I think was echoed elsewhere in the other two excellent presentations, which brings us back to tools. I mean, this is a round table devoted to the question of digital annotation tools. The word digital is there. So how does the digital relate to the physical is number one. So what do these tools do or don't do that changes the logic of what we do in physical space? After all, we don't live in screens. We inhabit bodies, and we exist as spatial and social creatures. Maybe the second one is, what do tools do? Which I think in David Levy's really rich concluding reflections on this issue, what can we expect of tools, and to what degree can Vannevar Bush's dreams, and it's a dream that recurs in the history of the development of tools, unleash these creative energies, actually unleash them? In a sense, the answer to those questions lie very much in the realm of institutions, I think, as you suggested. So how do we change the rule sets that realize the potentiality of tools to fulfill certain aspects of their destiny? And I think it was interesting. I mean, you mentioned this explicitly, David, and David Karger also mentioned Don Knuth as a figure. So Don, similarly, a major founding father figure in the history of systems computing, a passionate bibliographer and collector of letter types, the author of a multi-volume work on the history of typography and book forms. We're back again to this space of how do we add value, expand the possibilities, but also imagine strategies that bifurcate the worlds of the digital and the physical in ways that exploit the special affordances that each has. To what degree does convergence add value when it comes to note-taking? To what degree does diverging sets of practices? And it came up this morning, and I think it's part of a broader cultural trend, and I'd like to hear people respond to this. You know, the makers movement, craft, is having an absolutely, stellar, not just resurgence, but it's assuming a new form. The kind of cultures of making and private note-taking in Moleskine and other kinds of notebooks, these are products of the digital age. And so what they suggest to us is not just a kind of nostalgia, I would imagine, but actually a new kind of set of configurations for how people divide up the world, divide up and administer forms of information, think, process information. So with those brief remarks, I just wanted to open up the table to reactions, responses, engagement among the speakers. And please do come up to ask questions as you wish. Yeah.
So your question was very rich, and I think I've lost some pieces of it, but there was one thing that you said right at the end that I wanted to pick up on, which actually relates to some of what David Levy was talking about as well. In the work that we're doing on this annotation and on education in general, there's this really interesting tension, I think, between sort of pleasure and utility. I've never used an e-reader, and I doubt I ever will, because I love paper books and the sort of the feel of them and the way you can toss them around and just lie on your back and read them and so on and so forth. At the same time, I'm working on this digital annotation tool because there is function that you get out of this digital annotation tool that just isn't available on a paper, in a traditional paper form. And it will be wonderful if in some far future, the makers are able to create, paper books that also support digital annotation. But in the interim, we're going to, I think, always be faced with this sense that we're getting less pleasure out of the tools that we're using for their utility, and there's a different set of things that we make use of for pleasure. And it's always an interesting challenge to try and bring those together. I mean, Bob Stein quite rightly mentioned, I'm almost certain that I haven't seen the annotation tool, but I'm sure that it's more elegant than ours, because ours is really clunky. Because we were sort of trying to get as quickly as possible to something that we could use and experiment with, and so that doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. You should all still try it. But figuring out how to converge those things and have something which is both utilitarian and a pleasure to use is a really huge challenge.
Does one of you want to jump in, Bob? No, David?
I'll say a word. First, I hope that nothing that I've said is understood as in any way diminishing either the world of paper, materiality, or the world of the digital. In fact, I having been looking at these issues for at least 30 years now, in some ways I'm beginning to feel that dividing the world up in that way is not actually ultimately that useful a thing to do. I mean, more and more, just looking at my own practice, it's a very hybrid practice. And I'm actually thinking of, indeed, some of what you're saying, David, I can relate to. But I, for example, in my own reading and note-taking, I scan entire books in. I mean, I buy them first, by the way. I mean, and then I scan I scan a copy. And that, I mean, for books that are not yet digitally available, and that allows me to do my own unique forms of annotation, which sometimes means printing stuff out again, and then writing in pen in the margin, and sometimes scanning that back in. So I don't even know that the issue is that we need to have, the right tool that's going to do everything, but rather we're very lucky to have a great range of choices. And we're heading into an increasingly hybrid world where I don't think online versus offline is necessarily going to be the way to think of it.
I just want to report from the Twitter stream a question which directly engages something that was touched upon in this conversation, which is from Morbid Flight. I have a question. How do we make tools that preserve the playfulness in engaging with sources, and how do we teach with such tools? I'll leave that on the table and let our other question.
Great question.
Yeah, but it's a great question, I think.
Douglas Klein, regarding the annotation project, how do you determine which of the annotations to incorporate into the text or other instructional materials, and how much to leave for the students to come up with themselves if they do? And how do we know to what degree the class that you studied is about estimation algorithms or something like that was representative? Maybe it's that class, that general subject matter, that group of students, that particular combination, what have you. I know you picked it out because you had that huge number of responses in the past, but for all we know, it's representative or not, or what have you.
Well, to do the specifics first, we picked out that class because as sort of a best use example of the tool. It was not intended to be a representative use, but what can be achieved with the right combination of circumstances. And that combination included an extremely gifted teacher who was already excited about this notion of having students annotate materials. And who was willing to make it a requirement in the class, and who was very engaged in the discussion. I mean, in terms of percentage, that faculty member made very few of the annotations, but he was a real presence in the discussions, and I think that was a tremendous motivator for the students to be there as well, knowing that the faculty member was listening. So that was definitely a best case scenario. However, we've seen enough other good cases to know that it's not a non-repeatable exception. That there have been many classes where we've gotten 50 or 60 annotations per student over the course of a semester, taught in all sorts of subjects at all sorts of universities. There are many ways that it can fail. I mean, I'd say that about half of the classes that have used NB have had no success with it at all. They tend to be the ones like mine where NB usage is voluntary. That's something we're still exploring. I mean, that's part of the research, is what is it, what sort of ecology, what sort of tools, what sort of incentives do you need to create in order to really engage students and get them to make use of this technology and benefit from it. And we don't know the answers yet. We just have certain indications of what seems to work well and what does not.
Bob, I was wondering if on this point you could say something about the history of social book. I remember having a really interesting conversation with you about how you found people using it in unexpected ways, because I think that's one of the larger questions that hovers around tool building, is often the most powerful tools are tools that were not designed to do what they actually end up doing.
The unexpected use you're referring to is one day with our tool, it's very easy to put things into it. And I just took an email, in-house email from one of the designers, and I put it into Social Book. Because you know how at the end of a day, if you're following an email thread with 4 or 5 people, you're spending increasingly more of your time unpacking the thread than you are actually dealing with the content. Oh my God, did Susie write that before she read Johnny's comment or after Johnny's comment? Some people insert at the beginning, some people at the end. Well, the way Social Book works, you just get a perfectly threaded conversation, and there's no question about any of that. And we stopped using email that day. We haven't used it in-house now for 4 or 5 months. And I got very interested in this question, and I sort of said to myself, we certainly didn't set out to replace email. What did we actually do? So I took this particular conversation, it was just a 4-paragraph email, and I put it into Google Docs, and I tried to recreate the conversation, and it was a disaster. Because Google Docs is fundamentally, it's a environment where somebody basically took a word processor and grafted social on top of it, as well as they could, but not very well. We did something quite different, which was we built something from the very bottom, which assumed that at its core, what it was about was people being together. And I think when I showed this to Jeffrey, I showed him a sort of a Venn diagram of reading and writing, and this sort of space where they meet, I put the word thinking, because I think what happened was when humans started reifying the contents of conversation into permanent documents, what they did was they separated out the roles of writing and reading, which meant, and in effect, and what NB is doing, what we're doing, is I think we're putting them back together again, and they were making what, for want of a better term, I call a thinking processor. I mean, in a lot of ways, I mean, I have to comment about David's general perspective, which I think is crucial. Okay, I mean, it falls to me into the Sven Berkert's category of critique, which is an exquisite understanding of the best of the print era of human communication, and an acknowledgement and a fervent plea that we take what is important and best from that era and bring it with us into the new era. But I would argue fundamentally that it's not going to be the same. It's going to be different, which is not to put a value judgment on something. I'm not trying to do that, but I get very nervous when the boundaries that are drawn are the way we did things then is one boundary, and the way we're going to do things in the future is another boundary. The reality is we need to, as humans, figure out what works best for us, and part of that comes as an appreciation of where we've been and where we might go to. 5 more seconds, which is, I'd have to tell you, I'm not a technologist. I failed physics for poets. I could program my way out of a paper bag if I tried.
Can I pick up on that?
Yes.
So I love this sort of notion of sort of what's at the intersection of reading and writing, because I think there are some amazing opportunities there. historically, it seems that, there's this sort of stage of writing by an author, and then it's done, and then there's reading that happens afterwards. And annotation is a way for people to kind of work in the margins of that authored thing, but never to really get into it the way the original writer did. Now, when we look at things like Wikipedia, right, there isn't an author, there's everybody engaged in the creation of the artifact. And I'm really curious, I don't have the answers yet, but how do we take those people who are in the margins and bring them into actually participating in the enhancement and enrichment of the content of the text itself? This is perhaps not the right venue to suggest this, but what if we took the Canterbury Tales and put it up and said, hey, anybody think they can make this better? Right? Add a few verses or something like that. Why do we limit ourselves to sort of one static piece of content that's been created by an author and then is then immutable? How can it become more if we allow more people to engage with it?
I wanted to mention there are a number of questions that are hovering around the same conversation. One of them has to do with, is there any benefit, I'm just reading from the card, to reading a clean text the first time around? In other words, where does annotation begin? And where does it fit in a larger set of cognitive processes? But there also seems to be a rich question, which we can come back to, having to do with what we mean by contemplative engagement, even. Whether contemplative engagement is a kind of historically constructed notion, or whether it transcends kind of the particularity of a print delivery system, shall we say. I'm going to let one of the people standing patiently here at the microphone pose a question and join the conversation. Could you identify yourself, please?
Lisa Goldman.
Yes.
The tools that you've described to me are quite fascinating. My background is in developmental psychology, education, and business, which is kind of a little bit of an odd combination. In listening to you, I am excited by the potential of these tools, especially in creating more active learning processes for students. I can see so many ways in which they would dramatically increase students' engagement with what they're learning. My concern about our digital lives, not particularly your tools, but our digital lives, is that they're impacting our ability to think, because this is something I'm particularly interested in. And just the process of writing by hand or reading a book, by its very nature, is slower than many digital options. Writing by hand is often slower than typing, depending on how good a typist you are. And what I'm wondering, as you develop these tools, how much you engage with people who are experts in education and in cognitive psychology to test the impact that your tools will have on our ability to think. Even sitting in an audience like this, there are many, many people on digital devices. Some of them are listening to you, and some of them are not. And our whole emphasis on multitasking as a culture, I think is damaging our ability to think to some degree. So that's enough. I just would like you to address those issues.
I would just give you an anecdotal report from a teacher, sort of a master teacher at secondary schools, been teaching for 30 years. And she used a social book with a class reading Don Quixote in Spanish. And she said three things. A, boundaries of the classroom completely disappeared. She said the kids talk in class, they keep talking, they keep the conversation going in the margins, they come back into class, and they refer to what each other said in the margin. Second, she doesn't have to write, the kids don't write papers or take quizzes anymore. It's all there in the margin. And the third one, which is the most interesting, and it's really part A and B. Part A is that the lazier students, The ones who might just pass off a C paper don't do it anymore because they're working in the presence of their peers and they work much harder. And part B is that she said she has, and she's now used this several times, she has never, she said, seen the quality of engagement, not just the quality of engagement, but the quality of thinking that's going on among the students in the class precisely because they are bouncing ideas off each other.
And I'll actually flip around something that you said. You pointed out that often handwriting is slower, but I would say that that there's actually a benefit to a discussion forum that it's slower, right? If you contrast what's going on in class, the faculty member is steamrolling ahead on whatever it is that they have to cover that day. And yes, they can pause for a question, but what happens to the student who has to take some time to assemble their thoughts or go back and look at something in order to figure out what it is that they want to ask, right? So one of the things that I think is valuable about the online forum is that it can happen at the pace of the person who wants to have the discussion and isn't driven by something that's going on the outside. There certainly are kind of boundary issues. When we first started working on NB, our idea was that it would be used in class and that students would, while listening to the lecture, also be kind of posting questions the way people are now on Twitter and so on and so forth. We got a lot of negative faculty feedback about how, well, then they won't be paying attention to me, right? But is that really a problem? I mean, if we think of the faculty member not as a lecturer but as a facilitator, you could argue that there could be real value to driving more peer-to-peer engagement in the classroom of students, one student asking a question. Sorry, you only have one faculty member. They can only ask or answer one question at a time. If you set all of the students free, then each of them can be engaged in asking/answering a question instead of just taking that passive role, which doesn't contribute so much to education. I'd love to do more education-grounded research. MIT, unfortunately, doesn't have an education department, but we're hoping, as edX evolves and we sort of grow into that space, there will be an opportunity for education research collaborations.
Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Nate Awning, and I'm not an academic. I'm an open source software developer. And in my experience in the software world, especially with open source, we have a lot of annotation tools that we use. GitHub is sort of touted as the social coding, sort of the place that all developers are going today to collaborate. So my question is twofold. One is, what can we all learn from open source and sort of how that collaboration process works? And two, I noticed your NB software is open source. So what's the importance of keeping these tools open and available for other people to contribute to them, so we don't get big companies sort of locking down this knowledge and putting up paywalls so we can't get to it? So if you could address those two questions, I'd love to hear your answers.
Who wants to start? That seems like a...
Open source is good.
Yeah, I guess you sort of answered the question by sort of talking about how it's great if it doesn't get stuck behind company paywalls. And I mean, it is in keeping with sort of annotation or communal creation notion, right? That if you put out a piece of software that only you're working on, well, there's limits to how much creativity you can put into it and so forth. If you open it up to something that can take contributions from a large audience to improve it, then hopefully you can go farther with it, and there can just be more there if you can find a way for people to engage. I don't know that I've seen a lot of what I would call annotation in software development, and it's actually something I've been quite interested in. I see plenty of version control and logging, as in, here's the new version and here's what I did with the new version. But the way you annotate software is by commenting, and nobody does that, right? Which is kind of unfortunate.
Or it's not visible.
And yeah, so there's a real challenge there. I'd love to see us bring annotation to software development, and the ability to sort of draw connections between different parts of the code and say what this is doing and sketch things on your code that other people will see. That would be wonderful, but I actually don't think it's done very much right now.
Did you want to jump in, David?
No, not
No,
on this.
not this one. Okay, please.
Bob Stein talked about the value of individual perspective, and I completely agree. And it struck me when you said that, because while David Karger, while you were talking about taking this personal process of annotation and turning into a collaboration, I was thinking to myself, might this not interfere with the development of individual perspective? Might you end up, I mean, I understand the value, the virtues of collaboration, but might you end up with individual perspectives being unduly influenced by what's going on among peers? Peer engagement is sometimes a good thing, not always a good thing, and I guess it gets back to the kind of thing that David Levy was talking about, which is balancing these sometimes opposing values, because I was, well, I'll leave it at that. You know, how do we develop individual perspective while at the same time encouraging all of this collaboration?
Anyone want to start on that? David?
Well, here's one feedback. We generally think of collaboration as a cooperative process, but it can also be an adversarial process. And I think one of the things that can really help you in developing an individual perspective is having that perspective challenged by other people and being forced to defend that perspective, right? So if you sit by yourself and work out an interpretation and nobody ever questions it, you could go off into all sorts of strange directions. And yes, perhaps sometimes they're good directions, but I think there is real value to being reined in by other people's responses.
I was just going to say something that Jeff Nunberg and Umberto Eco had a conference and published a book some time ago called The Future of the Book. And there's an article in there by historian Carla Hess from Berkeley that was probably the most important thing I've ever read in the last 10 years as far as my thinking goes. Because I'm not sure you understood me, because I think I stand much more strongly with David. Because she says that the very concept of the individual in many ways arose with print. And I actually think that over the next couple hundred years, our notion of the individual is going to give way to the notion of a collaboration. Now, it's impossible for people like us. You know, if you're in this room, if you're at Harvard, you know, you got here by being a very powerful individual. And we're not really the best at knowing what it's going to be like when humanity changes to some extent. And it's not going to be quick. It's not going to be in a generation. It's not going to be in 2 generations. But I think we are moving towards a collaborative space. And the tools that David and I are building, to me, are tiny, tiny steps into that future.
My colleague and friend David Weinberger tweeted, I hope he won't be offended that I'll read this out loud because it's a provocation that goes in this direction.
I know David, so what do you have to say?
Which is, private note-taking seems selfish to me. Make it all public. I mean, which is to say that tools are not value neutral. They promote certain models of learning, certain social models, certain even concepts of what society could be or should be. And that's a good thing, right?
Well, I'm going to slightly refine what David said. I don't sort of see private note-taking as selfish. I see it as lazy. I think that my perspective in a lot of the research that I do is that there is a lot of information that people would be willing to share if it wasn't so hard, or if it wasn't hard at all. And I think that a lot of the note-taking that goes on, right? Ask a random student, would it be okay if we put your notes up for other people to look at those notes? I think a lot of them would say yes, and some of them would say no. But there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of the information that's currently being generated privately to become publicly available, and I think that's a social good if it happens. And the real challenge is removing the barriers to that kind of information sharing.
Any other thoughts on that question?
I'm thinking about it. So, one thing that makes me nervous is when we start making sort of black and white distinctions that say, my least favorite example is, Nicholas Carr, Google is making us stupid. Right. So the answer is either that Google is making us stupid or Google is making us smart. And there's no more room for really then investigating the reality of different people's experience and lives. And it seems to me, regarding private versus public annotation, there needs to be plenty of room for individual difference, and not trying to, sorry, David Weinberg, I guess he's listening.
Yeah, I think so.
Hi, David.
He's tweeting actively.
Saying, yeah, it's all got to be one way or the other.
Would you like to pose a question?
Yes, my name is Barbara Bates, and two quick questions. One is, what's the grading rubric used for the NB software where it's compulsory? Mm-hmm. And the second question relates to, are there examples of how this social software is used to improve, to actually increase creativity, inventiveness, or cross-disciplinary sharing and new knowledge formation?
I presume by this software, is this software, you mean social software in general, or do you mean specifically?
The two things that you're using, or in general, either.
We don't have any kind of grading.
So so we did not choose a grading rubric as part of our design of the tool, right? And actually, Sanjoy, with this early adopter, was the one he basically imported the grading rubric he'd already been using in his paper annotation assignments, which was students must invest a decent effort. That was the grading rubric. And he said that it was very important for it to be vague. Because if you told the students exactly what to do, then that's what they would do. And we have had an example that there was another class where the requirement was students must write 2 notes, and every single student just wrote 2 notes, and that was that. And it didn't get the same kind of take up as it did from Sanjoy's class. And so we've kind of there's a longer document that he also hands out. I forget the name of the where it came from, but it's this sort of discussion of reading memos, and it's kind of a plea from the faculty member saying, "Dear students, I'm confused and I don't know exactly what it is that you don't know. So please help me by giving me feedback on this text that I am providing to you." But the assignment itself was this sort of intentionally vague thing. And actually, well, I don't know if I should say this with so many people listening, but in the end, he really just kind of counted up how many characters the students were writing and left it at that. Because obviously, what you're looking for is kind of an average effort, and it's not that every single comment needs to be this brilliant contribution.
If you're old enough and grew up in New York in the 50s, we used to get on our report cards in primary school, there was sort of plays well with others, and but after, and we all got perfect, right? But after that, from then on, and everything that was important, we were graded individually. And what I think the kind of work that's going on here in collaborative studying leads us to think over the next long period of time where people start to get graded not on their individual ability, but on their ability to work well with others. And that we all play different roles. You know, David might be the genius who doesn't work very hard, but who has insights that move the rest of us forward. Whereas I might plod along and not actually have the insights, but have the ability to sort of, bring the group forward. We all play different roles. Many years ago, this issue of collaboration is fundamental. I worked for a long time to try to get some university somewhere to give a dissertation to somebody that was born digital that could not be rendered in a PDF. And it took a long time, but we finally did it back around the year 2000. And my new goal is to find a department somewhere in this country that will give a PhD to 2 people for 1 document. Because acknowledging the fact that sometimes knowledge is created by groups of people, not just by individual people.
I know one case, so we can talk about it.
Final question before we should close down here.
Yeah, this is a sort of a what-if question. We've mostly been talking about the annotation of texts that are already considered authoritative. But of course, to become authoritative, they tend to go through peer review. So most of us in this room have gotten notes back from anonymous reviewers. And I'm just thinking of the role in digital exchange and digital annotation in creating a culture that maybe blows away peer review as we know it. And that's my what if. What does that look like? And are we moving in that direction with open access?
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, is that Doug? No, it's not. MIT several years ago did a test. They actually took a book and set it out for regular closed peer review, and also put it up online in software we had built for open peer review. And what was interesting was that the results were not that different. They were actually pretty similar.
So I'm actually a bit of a Luddite here. I really believe in anonymous peer review, but I think that it can be done better, and annotation is one of the ways that I believe it can be done better. And since for the past few years, instead of just writing reviews, I've been sending annotated copies of the articles back to the readers, which may be standard in the humanities, but is not done in computer science. It turns out it's very hard to anonymize yourself when you're using Adobe to annotate a document, but I would love to see the review process become, I mean, still a peer review with anonymity, but one with more dialogue, where the reviewers can actually ask questions of the author, and the author can work to respond, and there's going to be this sort of collaborative improvement of the article. That would be wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you.